Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Stephen Kahn, and we are going over Robert Nozick's article about distributive justice. And this comes from his book, which was published in 1974, Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick. So this is in preparation for Exam 5. Part A, Question 2, of Rawls and Nozick, which presents the better argument on the nature of justice? Why? So we went over Rawls, and we can briefly go over that again after we go over Nozick. And this will also be covering Exam 5, Part B, Question 9, explain Nozick's entitlement theory. Okay, so the idea of distributive justice. What is a just way for the state to distribute wealth among the citizens? Should everyone have an exactly equal amount of money, or should some people have more, and if so, why? So we saw John Rawls give his idea. He said, first, here's his 2 principles of justice that you can arrive at behind the veil of ignorance of what your initial conditions are. Everyone will have an equal set of basic rights, and all the inequalities in society are only just if they contribute to the overall well-being of everyone in society. It's okay if some people are rich and some people are less rich, so long as the conditions of society that produce the wealthier people is helping everybody live a better life. And if it's not the case, then that is not a just social system, says John Rawls. So Robert Nozick, he's pointing out the difficulty with any scheme of distributing wealth according to some set pattern of justice that violates what he calls the philosophy of holdings. The subject of justice in holdings consists of 3 major topics, he says. The first is the original acquisition of holdings. How did you acquire wealth initially? The second concerns the transfer of holdings. How do you pass that along to other people? And the third is, how do you rectify the injustices of the first 2 principles? So the acquisitions of holdings, the principle of transfer of holdings, and the principle of rectification of violations of the first 2 principles. That's on the left-hand column at the top of page 49. So his basic point is that if you acquired your wealth in a just way, and you transferred it in a just way, then it's a just system, even if that means some people are going to be a lot wealthier than others. And his example is the Wilt Chamberlain example, famous basketball player. And I'll get into that example, but he ends by saying any other understanding of distributive justice, other than the one that assumes that if it's a just acquisition and a just transfer, then it's a just system. Any other situation, he says, would lead to constant intervention by the state in order to achieve some predetermined level of wealth distribution. And that would be nearly impossible to put into law, and he brings up the problems with trying to do so. So let me just let him do the talking here and read little selections from it. So page 487, he says, the term, well, actually, let me read the introductory note. So Robert Nozick, 1938 to 2002, professor of philosophy at Harvard University. Nozick argues that in treating all goods as though they were unowned and distributing them in accord with some preferred scheme, we ignore the sources of these goods in the labor and ingenuity of the people who created them. As he sees it, past history plays a crucial role in determining entitlements. If I acquired property appropriately through my own efforts or by a legal exchange with its rightful owner, then I should not have the property taken away from me in order to satisfy someone's conception of justice. Okay, the primary words there, I think, would be by a legal exchange. If you acquired your property appropriately by a legal exchange, one of the big issues in the United States of America is reparations for slavery. Should African Americans receive some kind of compensation for being the descendants of enslaved people? And when I read through this article by Nozick, he doesn't give a helpful solution to that problem, and I'll mention it when we get there. And he also says that he's not offering, I'll just read here, it's the bottom of page 488 in the right-hand column. He goes, the general outlines of the theory of justice in holdings are that the holdings of a person are just if he is entitled to them by the principles of justice in acquisition and transfer. Skipping a little, he says, if each person's holdings are just, then the total set distribution of holdings is just. To turn these general outlines into a specific theory, we would have to specify the details of each of the three principles of justice in holdings. The principles of acquisition of holdings, the principle of transfer of holdings, and the principle of rectification of violation of the first two principles. I shall not attempt that task here. So he's not trying to create a specific theory. He's just saying if the acquisitions of holdings were just and the transfer was just, then the system is just. But he's not going to try to attempt here to define exactly what would constitute a just acquisition and a just transfer. And another thing that he does not address is what if you've inherited wealth from a system, for example, in the United States, all of the unpaid labor of the slaves went into the pooled money of the society. So that was clearly an unjust acquisition of holdings. But then the principle of transfer of holdings is where it becomes cloudy because, for example, my father's parents both came to the United States from Ireland, so they didn't get any immediate advantage from the wealth of the slaves, although they did, if you consider the wealth of the United States is built on that. So to what degree are people inculcated, or to what degree are they linked to the injustice of the original acquisition after it's been passed down through society through several generations? That is a much more difficult question, but I think what Robert Nozick was thinking of more is, for example, an economic system like communism. Okay, who's going to decide what is this just distribution of wealth? And he's pointing out the difficulties with trying to do that. Okay, so page 487, the term distributive justice is not a neutral one. Hearing the term distribution, most people presume that something or mechanism uses some principle or criterion to give out a supply of things. Skipping down, he says, however, we are not in the position of children who have been given portions of pie by someone who now makes the last-minute adjustments to rectify careless cutting. There is no central distribution, no person or group entitled to control all the resources, jointly deciding how they are to be doled out. What each person gets, he gets from others who give to him in exchange for something or as a gift. In a free society, diverse persons control different resources, and new holdings arise out of the voluntary exchanges and actions of persons. There is no more a distributing or distribution of shares than there is a distributing of mates in a society in which persons choose whom they shall marry. So, who's going to distribute this wealth? Who has the right to determine how each individual person shares their wealth with others? And his image of the pie, it's not that someone owned the pie and then doled it out to these children. Everybody's making their own pies in their own ways. So what force could justly distribute a system as variegated like that? So he'll continue to say, page 487, the right-hand theory, the entitlement theory. The subject of justice in holdings consists of three major topics: The first is the original acquisition of holdings, the appropriation of unheld things. So how did you get what you own? The second topic concerns the transfer of holdings from one person to another. So what are the processes? Did you inherit it from your parents? Was it given to you for some services that you rendered? Was it given to you just as a gift? These are the principles that you have to deal with when you're dealing with the question of distributive justice. And so here's what he says. If the world were wholly just, this is page 48 on the left, the following inductive definition would exhaustively cover the subject of justice in holdings. A person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principles of justice in acquisition is entitled to that holding. A person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in transfer from someone else entitled to the holding is entitled to the holding. No one is entitled to a holding except by repeated applications of 1 and 2. So if you justly acquire your holding, your wealth, and if you transfer it to somebody else in a just way, then that system is just. And he'll go on to say that he's not going to specify the details of each of these three principles. He's not going to do that. He's just saying, in an ideally just, a wholly just society, if the acquisition is just, and if the transfer is just, then that system of wealth distribution is just. So, I will now, and he's just saying, if each of these moves in this system is just, from whence arises the injustice? I'm going to skip over now to the third principle of his theory of distributive justice, which is the principle of rectification of violations of the first two principles, which is the principle of acquisition and the principle of transfer. So he says on the right-hand column, page 488, he says, not all actual situations are generated in accordance with the two principles of justice in holdings. Some people steal from others, or defraud them, or enslave them, seizing their product and preventing them from living as they choose, or forcibly exclude others from competing in exchanges. Skipping a little bit, he says the existence of past injustice, previous violations of the first two principles of justice in holdings, raises the third major topic under the justice in holdings, the rectification of injustice in holdings. If past injustice has shaped present holdings in various ways, some identifiable and some not, what now, if anything, ought to be done to rectify these injustices? What obligations do the performers of injustice have towards those whose position is worse than it would have been had the injustice not been done? Okay, so the question he didn't ask is what obligations do the people who inherit wealth from the direct performers of injustice have towards the descendants of those who were unjustly stolen from? That would be for the question of reparations for descendants of slaves. That would be the question that would have to be addressed. He does not address that question here. But it would definitely be an interesting philosophical question. But I think what he does talk about would shed some light on the conditions that you'd have to address in order to come up with a theory of distributive justice for reparations for past enslavement of whole peoples. It wouldn't apply just to the United States of America. It could apply to a lot of different parts of the world. All right, so here is his point now, the Wilt Chamberlain example, and how it shows that any predetermined system of economic redistribution of wealth would have to be constantly interfering in people's lives in order to maintain some unnatural status quo, as opposed to, he'll say, the neutral power of the market, which automatically organizes things. All right, so the Wilt Chamberlain example is he arranges a deal where he gets 25 cents for every dollar for each home game. There's two buckets even. One's a quarter for him and then 75 cents for everybody else. So would that kind of a situation disturb your own preferred system of distributive justice. So page 489 on the left, it is not clear how those holding alternative conceptions of distributive justice can reject the entitlement conceptions of justice and holdings. All right, he's saying it's not clear how anyone could disagree with what he said so far, that if it was a just acquisition of wealth and a just transfer of wealth, this system is just. For suppose a distribution favored by one of these non-entitlement conceptions is realized. So suppose you are a communist and you're saying, no, if you derived your private property through this capitalist system, that's inherently evil. Or suppose that you are a feudal lord in the Middle Ages and you say, no, the noble class deserves the wealth and the serfs should live off of the scraps from the table. So whatever other form of distributive justice you have in mind, how would that deal with what he calls the Wilt Chamberlain example? Let us suppose it is your favorite one, and let us call this distribution D1. This is your preferred economic situation. It exists. Let's just assume that there is a state of affairs where it's in place. Perhaps everyone has an equal share. That would be communism. Perhaps shares vary in accordance with some dimension you treasure. For example, the feudal system, the shares of the noble class would be greater. Now suppose that Wilt Chamberlain is greatly in demand by basketball teams. And then so he takes 25 cents of every dollar. He ends up with $250,000 because 1 million people come to see him. He's the main attraction. They wouldn't have come if he wasn't playing, certainly not as many. So then he says, is he entitled to this income? Is this new distribution D2 unjust? So you preferred it the way it was before he did this big tour and got $250,000. Now all of a sudden, a lot of other people have given them shares of his money. That's disturbed the whole pattern that you previously, that you wanted to be in place. So is this new distribution D2 unjust? If so, why? There is no question about whether each of the people was entitled to the control over the resources they held in D1. Each of these persons chose to give 25 cents of their money to Chamberlain. They could have spent it on going to the movies, on candy bars, or on copies of Dissent magazine or Monthly Review, but they all, at least 1 million of them, converged on giving it to Wilt Chamberlain. If D1, the situation, the economic distribution of wealth before Wilt Chamberlain played, if that was a just distribution and people voluntarily moved from it to D2, transferring parts of their shares they were given under D1, he says, what was it for if it was not to do something with? Isn't D2 also just? So he's saying D1 was just. Now it's the shares, the balance of wealth has changed, but everyone voluntarily changed it. So isn't it also just? They could have done anything they wanted to with their money and they gave it to Wilt Chamberlain. So why would that be now unjust? So skipping a little bit, he says, after someone transfers something to Wilt Chamberlain, third parties still have their legitimate shares. Their shares are not changed. So then he gives here's his point. The general point illustrated by the Wilt Chamberlain example is that no end state principle or distributional patterned principle of justice can be continuously realized without continuous interference with people's lives. Any favored pattern would be transformed into one unfavored by the principle, by people choosing to act in various ways. Skipping a little, he says, to maintain a pattern, one must either continually interfere to stop people from transferring resources as they wish to, or continually or periodically interfere to take from some persons resources that others, for some reason, chose to transfer to them. But if some time limit is to be set on how long people may keep resources others voluntarily transfer to them, why let them keep these resources for any period of time? Why not have immediate confiscation? Oh, Wilt Chamberlain, you just went out and played a game. You drew 1 million people to come see. You got $250,000. That has disrupted the previous distribution pattern, so now we will confiscate that and redistribute it right back to the people who gave it to you. That's what he's saying. It might be objected that all persons voluntarily will choose to refrain from actions which would upset the pattern. This presupposes unrealistically, and here's his 3 unrealistic presuppositions, that even if people wanted to maintain some complete equal distribution of wealth. He says, even if they wanted to, it presupposes three things unrealistically. One, that all will most want to maintain. All right, so you're assuming that all would want that, so some might not. You're assuming that all will most want to maintain the pattern, or those who don't, to be re-educated or forced to undergo self-criticism in quotation marks. Two, that each can gather enough information about his own actions and the ongoing activities of others to discover which of his actions will upset the pattern. How am I going to upset the pattern? I don't know what everyone else is doing in the market today. So even if I want to maintain the pattern, I don't have enough information on how to do that. I mean, am I not allowed to go get food? How would it be paid for? And number three, the diverse and far-flung persons can coordinate their actions to dovetail into the pattern. Compare the manner in which the market is neutral among persons' desires as it reflects and transmits widely scattered information via prices and coordinates persons' activities. So he's saying the free market system where you're free to buy and sell what you want is preferable. It's more realistic. To maintain some other distribution pattern of wealth, you would have to have state interference, whereas the free market is a self-correcting machine. It just automatically corrects itself, so he says. Karl Marx would obviously disagree with what he's saying there. But I think he simplifies his argument. He's saying, I'm not going to attempt the task of defining the specific details of what constitutes a just acquisition and transfer of holdings, but let's just assume in a wholly just society, he says over on 488 on the left, that if everyone is just, and let's just assume we know what justice is, a just holding that you've acquired justly and that you've transferred to someone else justly, each step in that situation is just, so the outcome must necessarily also be just. And trying to come up with any other distribution pattern according to some other principle, he says, would be not realistically enforceable and probably not even just, it seems to me, is what he's saying. So let me go back now and look at, this is exam 5, part A of Rawls and Nozick, which presents the better argument on the nature of justice, why and explain. So Rawls is saying, yeah, it's okay to have inequalities of wealth, provided that those inequalities are better for everybody. On page 485, he says, the principles of justice that you derive behind the veil of ignorance. If you mention Rawls, you've got to mention this veil of ignorance. Assuming you don't know your natural talents or your economic advantages or disadvantages, that you're just a human being who's reasonable. Put yourself in that initial position. Okay, what would I think from this position as a just society? You wouldn't be inclined to be against, his example is welfare laws. If you were rich, you might say, oh, welfare, oh, that's not fair. You're giving money from people who work to people who don't work. If you were poor and you're unemployed and you can't find a job, you say, oh, yeah, it's fair because the whole system, I'd work if I could, there's no jobs, you control the means of production, so what do you want me to do, die here? I got a right to live. So if you don't know if you're rich or poor, what then would be your perspective on that question? You wouldn't favor the rich or the poor side. So if you can train yourself to just imagine that you don't know anything other than that you're a rational human being, what kind of a just society would you create? This is very similar to what Plato did in the Republic. Let's discover what justice is by developing an ideally just society. That's what they did. And I think Rawls and Plato come to a similar conclusion. So page 485, two principles of justice regarding the distribution of wealth. He says, second, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to the positions and offices open to all. So Wilt Chamberlain, to go back to Robert Nozick, yeah, he can have that $250,000 he earned if that system is going to be to everybody's benefit, to everyone's advantage. And you could say it is. Each of those people who gave him 25 cents out of their dollar is advantaged by seeing an excellent basketball player. You don't see a player with that kind of talent very often, and one of the goods of life is to observe wonderful things. So why not spend your money? You're going to spend it on something. This is better for everybody. Wilt Chamberlain wouldn't have had the motivation to become expert at his skill had he not known I can become very wealthy. So that motivation has benefited everyone. You could say that. Or you could say no, because there's only a finite amount of wealth. I guess you'd have to include the labor value in there, and then there's so many people. But at any rate, let's just assume there's a finite amount of wealth. Okay, now you've got $250,000. That's that much less wealth that's capable of being distributed to everybody else. And somewhere along the line, when you're sucking up that wealth, it's got to come from somewhere, and now somebody's got nothing to eat. You could argue something like that. In which case, no, he shouldn't be able to get $250,000. Maybe he should be able to get $20,000. But what Nozick is saying is any kind of scheme like that hampers this free exchange would have to be constantly interfering in people's lives, and would furthermore presume that the people are aware of how all of their actions are affecting the overall distribution of wealth. The free market system is a superior plan because you don't have to regulate it all the time. It naturally happens that the law of supply and demand balances itself out. Now, maybe in an actual free market that might be the case, but what if competitors in the so-called free market can influence the politicians to legislate it in the economic system in such a way that it unjustly favors other parties? That's obviously would be something that you'd have to address. And Robert Nozick himself says he's not attempting to get into the details. He's just giving this general idea of a theory of distributive justice. Okay, so that was part A, just comparing the two. And when I mentioned Rawls and his idea that inequalities are okay if it's to the advantage of everybody, that is a lot like Plato. And I want to go back and just read where he says that after the prisoner's released from the cave and sees, the absolute idea of the good, that person is told, go back into the cave, go back into the material conception of the world and take your part in politics and help others come out of the delusion of identification with the material world so that they can see the eternal absolute forms of knowledge from which everything emanates. And then it was objected that that's not just, because you're forcing somebody to go to a worse position, whereas they've just escaped. And then Socrates replies, this is page 447, the bottom of the left-hand column, you have forgotten again, my friend, that the law is not concerned to make any one class specially happy, but to ensure the welfare of the commonwealth as a whole. By persuasion or constraint, it will unite the citizens in harmony, making them share whatever benefits each class can contribute to the common good. And its purpose in forming men of that spirit was not that each should be left to go his own way, but that they should be instrumental in binding the community into one. So that, I think, in that part of the Republic, it's a lot more similar to John Rawls. And so is this whole idea of the veil of ignorance. For Plato, it's let's develop an ideal society. Like an individual soul, what is justice? Oh, the soul is a small thing. We can't see what justice is on such a small scale. Let's expand the individual soul to an ideally just society. If we can find justice in that expanded version of the soul called society, then we can extrapolate to what it is in the individual soul. It's similar to this veil of ignorance. It's just this hypothetical situation from which you can try to discover what is justice. And for Plato, for Socrates, as described by Plato in the Republic, it's when each of the three parts of society performs its function properly to the benefit of the whole. So he does believe in a natural caste system, although he's saying your caste isn't determined by who your parents are, it's determined by the qualities that you manifest in society, and that people born to parents from a lower class should be raised up if they have the qualities of a higher caste, and vice versa. All right, but Robert Nozick is saying, no, you're not going to have, it's unrealistic to assume you're going to have some kind of a class of philosopher kings that would be able to identify all of the many contributing factors of such a distribution pattern. So at any rate, the question is, who do you think presents the better argument, Rawls or Nozick? I threw Plato in there because it's so similar to what Rawls was trying to do. And then for part B, question 9, explain Nozick's entitlement theory. You are entitled to wealth as long as it was acquired justly or transferred to you justly. And that's the only criteria that you need to be concerned with, not some predetermined distribution pattern. So long as you got it fairly and or received it fairly, then it's justly acquired.